The following program is made possible by the friends and partners of GodQuest Ministries.
Should the life of Charles Darwin be celebrated? From the CTN studio in Pensacola, Florida, this is the Creation Today show. I'm one of your hosts, Eric Hovind, and I'm joined by somebody who speaks similarly to Charles Darwin, Paul Taylor.
Without the beard, as it happens.
But you guys, you got to sound just like him, man. He had to sound like you.
I've never heard him speak.
He's English.
Contrary to popular opinion, I'm not that old. But
you guys all speak the same.
During the week that we're actually recording this show, we understand that there are moves afoot in Congress to make Darwin Day, February the 12th, a federal holiday. Should we actually celebrate Darwin in that way?
Interesting question, and it rhymed. You're going to enjoy today's Creation Today show as we talk about Charles Darwin. Well, as you know, Charles Darwin is given credit for the theory of evolution in today's textbooks. Kids are being taught this theory of evolution, aren't they, Paul? As if it really happened, as if it's a fact.
Well, one of the interesting things is, I studied a lot of to do with education. I was a school teacher in England and Wales for a long time, and education in England has changed over a period of time where the theory of evolution is not allowed to be questioned. But of course, that's the case here in the United States as well. I've been looking particularly recently at the information that comes out of the Florida Department of Education, the state that we're in here. And again, it's not so much that they're saying don't ever criticize Charles Darwin and his ideas, but they're saying comments like, well, the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. And then we move on. There's not the opportunity given for saying anything.
I know that the new science standards say that evolution is the fundamental principle that governs all of biology. And so they're putting that in there to try to say, look, you really can't, if you question it, like Bill Nye said recently, if you question it, you're really just not that intelligent.
Which means then that Charles Darwin becomes a great folk hero. And of course, Charles Darwin's birthday is February the 12th. He was born on February the 12th, 1809 in Shrewsbury in the English Midlands, very close to the Welsh border. And that date, therefore, has a huge implication for the whole of Western society on both sides of the Atlantic. And on both sides of the Atlantic, discussions are underway as to whether national holidays should be made out of his birthday. It's certainly being discussed in Britain, and it's my understanding that Congress in the United States are also discussing whether February the 12th should become a federal holiday called Darwin Day.
Darwin Day could be happening. You could get vacation, kids out of school, for Darwin Day at some point in the future.
I mean, we could celebrate it with a special Darwin cake, couldn't we? It's very easy to do. All you have to do is throw the flour and the eggs and the butter straight into a bowl and leave it to evolve.
Oh, nice. The beautiful Darwin cake. I like it. Speaking of Darwin cake, because this has nothing to do with the Darwin cake, I would just like to say thank you to some of the men and women out there that have really paved the way, so to speak, for you and I, Paul. I mean, they've really laid it out there for us just to walk down. I mean, I think of people like Charles Darwin that we're talking about today, and Richard Dawkins would be one that I'd like to thank. And well, there's Niles Eldridge, of course.
Yes.
I think of Eugenia Scott, Ernst Haeckel, Stephen Jay Gould. These people have really paved the way for us by allowing us to have a job, to do what we do. I mean, here these minds are obviously proponents of Darwin's theory, or a version of Charles Darwin's theory, and they are really what's the word?
They've been responsible for
vigorous about it.
for the work that we do. Now we're being a bit flippant, but then of course, if they hadn't existed and if the theory of evolution hadn't existed, then there would have been some other attack on the authority of Scripture, which we would have been dealing with instead, because it is all about the authority of Scripture. But this is really what we're talking about, is in relation to Darwin's influence on society society today, because the whole point about Darwinism, the whole point about his idea is that it has given people a new creation myth, if you like,
Correct.
a new explanation of origins that can try and explain where we have come from without reference to God.
All right, so I got a question, Paul. How much has Darwinism affected culture today? What are we seeing today because of Darwinism? Obviously, we know that what you believe determines how you behave. I use that and I go, you look at evolution, what's the effect in culture today? What's happening today because of that?
There's a huge amount that's been influenced by Darwinism. You know, even our education system has been
Obviously,
influenced by
that's heavily
Darwinism. We know, for example, that Dewey was a great evolutionist, and the whole structure of wanting children to progress through a number of grades and sort of ever increasing upwards is an evolutionary concept.
I knew school was bad. I just knew it. No, that's not what you're saying, but I kind of thought that as I was going through.
I'm not necessarily saying that all these things are necessarily bad, but we can see the influence of Darwinism on society, very much a society that is moving away from God, trying to explain things without God.
And now I think what we're seeing is it go even a step farther, where people, I just watched an interview recently where they're talking about how if we are just evolved, which we are, of course, if we're one of all the other things here, we really should be paying homage to Mother Earth that has given rise to all of life, and it leads to the whole green movement. It leads to some of the things that people are doing today, again, as the result of Charles Darwin's work.
That's right. I mean, there are a number of things that have really come out of Darwin that are of great harm to society. One example that comes straight off the top of my head is that one commentator in the United Kingdom once mentioned that racism, for example, was prevalent before Darwin, but once the theory of evolution had been published in 1859, the whole topic took off at a much greater rate.
Well, Dawkins, I believe, I'm not going to get this quote exactly right, you'll have to look it up, but he said something like, I would not want to live in a society that is governed by evolution, Darwinian evolution, because that's not it's not exactly the nice, kind, loving society that you want to be a part of.
He believes that we've evolved to a point where we don't need to have social Darwinism anymore, so he wouldn't want to live in that sort of society.
Unbelievable. Well, coming up, here's what we got. I asked Paul, who wrote the book Darwin and Darwinism 150 years later, I asked Paul to do a special segment for us, and in this segment, Paul, you really lay out the history of Darwin's life. Because a lot of people think, oh, Darwin went on this tour to the Galapagos Islands, saw a variety of finches, and thought, aha, bingo, I got an idea. God's word may not be true after all.
That's right. And of course, there is the idea that Darwin believed the Bible completely before that, and then suddenly, by seeing the scientific evidence, he was convinced the Bible was wrong. What we're going to talk about is that is not the way it happened.
Not to mention his deathbed confession, and he's in heaven singing right now. Well, after this break, I want to go right into this segment with Paul Taylor. He is going to be talking about the life of Darwin and giving you the true story.
There is an enduring myth that Charles Darwin started life as a biblical Christian, and that eventually, when he reached the Galapagos Islands on his famous voyage on the Beagle, that the evidence that he saw there on his travels convinced him that the world had not come about as the Bible said, but rather through a process of evolution by natural selection over millions and millions of years. Now that is the myth that he started from biblical Christianity to rejecting that. The truth is, as always, a lot more subtle. Charles Darwin was born in 1809. He was born in the English border town of Shrewsbury, close to the Welsh border, on a long meander of the River Severn. His father, Robert Waring Darwin, was a doctor, and he was a well-known citizen in the town, as most doctors would have been at that time. His house, Mount House, which he had built himself, was actually outside the town, outside the meander of the River Severn. And citizens from around the place came to see him. The older Robert Darwin not only treated them for their medical complaints, but actually had quite a thriving business on the side, lending money to rich people around the place in the days when you couldn't get loans from banks. And therefore a lot of the high-class people of the area were greatly in debt to Robert Darwin in more ways than one. Robert Darwin was notionally a member of the parish church of Shrewsbury at St. Chad's. However, he never attended the church, and this was quite common for people in that era. In fact, the letters between Robert Darwin and his son Charles actually do illustrate the fact that Robert Darwin was, in practice, an atheist. So on the one side of the family, you've got atheism. Now, in fact, Robert Darwin's own father, Erasmus Darwin, was also an atheist, and I'll visit him in just a moment. But going to the other side of Darwin's family, his mother was Susanna Wedgwood. Susanna Darwin, like the rest of the Wedgwood family, was a Unitarian. And as a child, the young Charles was taken along to the Unitarian church in downtown Shrewsbury. Now, I visited this church when I was making a documentary film on the subject of the life of Charles Darwin. It's interesting that as we were filming outside the door of the church, an elder came to us and asked us if we'd like to film inside. Then he had second thoughts and asked if we were for Darwin or against him, and finding out that the film was about creationism, he shut the door on us literally as well as figuratively. The plaque outside the Shrewsbury Unitarian Church shows that it's not even necessary to believe in God to be part of that church. The pastor of the church at the time that Darwin was there was a man called Reverend Case, and he also operated a grammar school from his house, a very small grammar school, but it was there that Charles Darwin got his first educational experience. From the house where the Reverend Case ran his grammar school, it was just a short walk to Dingle Quarry, which is now a recreation ground known as Dingle Gardens. But in Darwin's day, it was just a quarry, a piece of wasteland, and it was there that Case used to take the young Darwin and the other students so that they could learn about natural history. And it was there that Darwin picked up his love of natural history and his love of collecting insects, particularly beetles. So his two parents, therefore, were not biblical Christians. We had an atheist father and we had a Unitarian mother. Susanna's father was Josiah Wedgwood. Josiah Wedgwood and Erasmus Darwin, Darwin's other grandfather, were great friends. The two of them were members of the Lunar Society, which was a society, a dining club society, that met in Birmingham, England, in order to discuss political and philosophical issues. And the main political and philosophical issues of their day, when they were younger, was the French Revolution, because the older Darwin and Wedgwood were in fact Jacobins. That is to say, they were supporters of the Revolutionary Party in France that had taken over the country and were proclaiming atheism, a godless rule that eventually, of course, led to the Reign of Terror and the guillotine in France. That is presumably the sort of philosophy that they were hoping to achieve in England with the overthrow of the monarchy and the overthrow of establishment Christianity. Erasmus Darwin was also notable for having written a book called Zoonomia, in which he proposed a theory of evolution, very similar to the theory of the French naturalist Pierre Lamarck. It was an evolutionary and atheistic philosophy of how animals could have developed. And it defies logic to suppose that the ideas of Erasmus Darwin were not an influence on the young Charles Darwin. So again, we see that there is much in the way of influence on Charles Darwin that is contrary to biblical Christianity. Now, eventually, Darwin went to Shrewsbury Grammar School after the death of his mother. Robert Darwin couldn't look after Darwin by himself, so he sent him full-time to Shrewsbury Grammar School, at which it turned out that Darwin was a very poor student. Robert Darwin clearly hoped that his son would follow him into the medical profession, and eventually sent him to Edinburgh University. At Edinburgh University, Darwin enjoyed his life a great deal, finding out a great deal about amateur geology and attending all sorts of lectures, but the one sort of lecture that he didn't like to attend would be anatomy lectures. I can't say I blame him. The idea of cutting up dead bodies to find out where the actual parts are in there is something that doesn't really thrill me either. But for that reason, Darwin soon flunked out of university. He left university after the first year, and he was then just wandering around, really living off his father's money, taking well-known excursions such as the famous excursion to Aberystwyth, looking for fossils and so on. And eventually his father told him that he couldn't just live his life off his allowance, and sent him to Cambridge University to study theology. Now, why would an atheist father send his son to Cambridge to study theology? The answer is that both Darwins had decided that the younger Darwin was going to go on and become a country parson, where he would not have a great deal to do during the day, be able to take a living from his stipend, and be able to pursue on the side his interests as a naturalist. This was quite a common thing for people to do in those days. So the only actual academic qualification that Charles Darwin ever got was a degree in theology from Cambridge University. To be fair, he was interested in it. He was particularly interested in the studies under the Reverend William Paley, the author of the well-known book Natural Theology. You may not have heard the title of the book, but you will probably have heard of Paley's famous watchmaker illustration, in which he says that if he came across a watch lying on the ground, he would not suppose that the watch had got there by chance. He would suppose that it had been designed by a watchmaker. Now, although that's a well-known illustration and one that I've used in talks myself, the whole subject of the Natural Theology book is that you can prove God and the nature of God without reference to the Bible. So the main theological influence on Charles Darwin at Cambridge University was this idea that you didn't need the Bible in order to have theology. So there again we see another influence on Darwin. His geological studies that he'd started on the side in Edinburgh continued, particularly as he picked up Charles Lyell's book, the first volume of his book, Principles of Geology, which really influenced him. He took that book with him on his famous voyage on the Beagle, and he arranged for the second volume to be sent to him. It arrived in port at Montevideo, so that Darwin was able to pick up that and read all about Lyell's views on the supposed millions of years of development of the rocks. And so by the time Darwin and the Beagle had sailed all the way around South America on their very slow, painstaking voyage, which was really concerned with navigation and finding out soundings to produce maps, by the time they reached the Galapagos and Darwin saw his famous finches and tortoises and so on, Darwin was already convinced of long ages in the rocks of millions of years, and his journals bear that out. So again we see that the influences on Darwin were not biblical Christianity, were not the concept that the Bible was true. So to summarize, was Charles Darwin a biblical Christian who rejected those views when he saw the finches and other animals at the Galapagos? No. He had an atheist but notionally Anglican father. He had a Unitarian mother. He had a Unitarian grammar school education. He had two grandfathers who were atheists and Jacobin revolutionaries, one grandfather of which had actually written a book giving a theory of evolution. His only theological influence, or his main theological influence, came from a man who believed you could prove the nature of God without reference to the Bible. And during the preparations and the early stages of the voyage on the Beagle, he was thoroughly influenced by the millions of years of geology ideas of Charles Lyell. Biblical Christianity being rejected at the Galapagos? Far from it. Darwin was already in a place where his views had already been formed before he ever saw his first Galapagos finch.
Can Christians believe the Bible from the very first word? This new study, The 6 Days of Genesis by creation speaker Paul Taylor, will help Christians understand exactly what happened during the creation week and why it is foundationally important to believe it. You will enjoy every minute of Paul's unique presentation style, combining scientific facts, solid biblical teaching, and a little British humor. For more information, visit us at www.creationtoday.org. In 1859, Charles Robert Darwin published On the Origin of Species, a book that has had a profound impact on the Western world ever since. Why was this book and its ideas so popular? Read as Ian McNaughton and Paul Taylor review Charles Darwin's religious ideas, setting them in the context of his background and family, and examine his evolutionary claims in the light of the Bible. To order this book, Darwin and Darwinism 150 Years Later, visit us at creationstore.org.
Welcome back to the Creation Today show. Paul, I really enjoyed that segment, really giving us the view of Darwin's life. I find that fascinating. If you've ever wanted to actually go in depth and do a little bit more study on the life of Charles Darwin himself, well, according to the religious leaders and high priests of atheism, they would say it's going to be a skewed view. But Paul, you were actually commissioned to do a book on the 200th anniversary of Charles Darwin's birth, weren't you?
Well, that's right, which was February the 12th, 2009. And the reason why my good friend Ian McNaughton and myself were asked to produce this book for that anniversary was because there wasn't really a creationist biography and appreciation of Darwin's life. So the first 4 chapters of the book I wrote as a brief biography of Charles Darwin, and then the remainder of the book analyzes Darwinism from a biblical point of view. There's a huge amount to say about Darwin because there's such a lot of mythology. They really have turned him, the atheist world has really turned him into a sort of atheist saint, so that he can do no wrong. I mean, when we were filming the documentary film that went with the book, we went filming at Down House in Kent. Now, Down House is under the control of English Heritage, a group that sort of look after stately homes and castles and things. And you go to any castle, say, under the control of English Heritage or Stonehenge or something, they'll give you an audio tour so that you can walk around. And at Stonehenge, that's a marvelous thing to do. You've got a huge area to do it. Down House is really quite a small building.
There's nothing, and it's not a
terribly interesting building, but the audio is not short. That's the point. The well-known British broadcaster David Attenborough is speaking to you. Hold this thing to you, and he's talking to you, and it really does make you want to stick 2 fingers down your throat, and it really is nauseating what actually comes out on this. It is not a biography of Darwin, it's a hagiography. You know, it talks about how beggars came to the door and this wonderful man came and gave them food and things. It's really, if they'd said he touched them and they turned to gold, I wouldn't have been surprised. It's absolutely nauseating.
So you're saying they are saying things now about Darwin that you're going, wow, this is not the Charles Darwin of history.
Exactly. They really sort of raised him up to a high pitch because they want to pretty much worship him as the person who has created the society we now live in. And to that much they are correct. So he has very much created the society we now live in, very largely.
Well, to today's individuals that are evolutionists that always accuse creationists of never have even read The Origin of Species, and we've never studied the life of Darwin. Actually, you know, we have done that, and Ray Comfort actually did a book republishing his Origin of Species, which I found interesting.
Well, the Origin of Species, of course, is in the public domain, so this is the complete first edition of the Origin of Species, but Ray did a 50-page introduction to it.
Love that intro, because he demolishes evolution, and he actually gave these away for free. Gave out, what was it, over 100,000 of them on the top 100 university campuses in America.
And also one university in the United Kingdom, which was Oxford University, because I led a team of evangelists there at Oxford University, we gave out a lot of these and got into a lot of very interesting conversations there.
Well, that's amazing. So if you want to do a study on Darwin's life, there are resources where you can get a obviously what we would consider a proper perspective of it.
I mean, this marvelous book by Jerry Bergman is called The Dark Side of Charles Darwin, and this shows that there's a lot of things that are quite dark about what Charles Darwin did and the way that he studied and the way that he, in some ways, falsified information. Even some evolutionists are on that, because a lot of people suspect that the actual theory of evolution by natural selection was really pretty much developed by Wallace, and that Darwin pretty much plagiarized a lot of what was there in order to come up with his theory.
Sounds like modern scientists today, if you ask me, Paul.
Yes.
We got the same kind of deceit and things like that happening in today's culture.
And we have another book here called The Secrets of the 6th Edition, which we also sell at creationstore.org.
Ooh, nice plug, thanks.
Secrets of the 6th Edition talks about the 6th edition of Origin of Species and shows that there are an awful lot of changes from the 1st edition. Darwin had to backpedal on a lot of things from the 1st edition, and the 6th edition is out there in the public domain too, so anyone can get hold of these on the internet and look and see the differences between those editions.
All right, so this brings me back to the original question that I asked at the beginning of the show. Should Darwin Day be celebrated as a national holiday? I mean, is this something that this is a guy that we want to lift up and say, hey, everybody look at him and look at the results of his work?
We don't want to lift him up at all. We don't. I don't mind actually noting the day as a day that's gone down in infamy, which that might
Pearl
might
Harbor
be worth.
Day. I can think of a few other bad days.
Exactly, but it's certainly not a day to celebrate, because there's a lot of bad things have come out of Darwinism. We're pleased that Richard Dawkins, as we reported before, does not want a society that's based on Darwinism, but that just shows that he's less consistent than certain other people in history. After all, you look at all the major genocides of the 20th century, they were carried out by people like evangelical Christians like Hitler. Oh no, wait a minute, he was a pagan, wasn't he?
Right.
Evangelical Christians like Joseph Stalin. No, wait a minute, he was an atheist evolutionist.
Yeah, Mao Zedong is the one that was the evangelical Christian.
No, he was an atheist evolutionist as well. Pol Pot, of course, he must have been. No, wait a minute, he was an atheist evolutionist.
It's amazing how many people have used the religion of evolution to rationalize the actions that they're taking.
Yes.
And you look down for the past century and a half, and that's exactly what we've seen.
And please don't misunderstand, we're not accusing evolutionists of being Nazis or being communists or anything like that, because we know that they're horrified by these things. But the reason why they're horrified by these things is because they're not as consistent in their evolutionism as many of these people were.
I don't know if you understand this, but Hitler was actually trying to be consistent with evolution.
Correct.
And actually rid the gene pool of the weaker
Survival
humans,
of the fittest.
so that the strongest could go on and we could actually, basically populate the world with the stronger and evolve to the next level.
That's right.
Well, for those of you that can't stand today's show because you disagree with us about the life of Charles Darwin and you think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, send us an email. We actually love listening to you guys. This has been an episode of Creation Today produced by GodQuest Ministries, and I want to thank Paul for doing all the work you did on the life of Charles Darwin. God bless.
Do you need the tools to defend your faith? Visit our websites for up-to-date content. Attend one of our live events. And shop online at creationstore.org. We are Creation Today.